gavel was already moving. I watched it from the corner of my eye, a slow, inevitable arc cutting through the dead air of Courtroom 7. Judge Harmon's wrist was already committed. His mouth was already forming the words that would bury me for the rest of my life. 5 seconds. The officers behind me had tightened their grip on my shoulders an hour ago and never let go. I could feel their fingers pressing into the white fabric of my shirt, right above the ink that had convicted me before the trial even started. The handcuffs bit cold into my wrists. The chain between them clinked once, then went still, like even the metal had decided to stop fighting. 4 seconds. I didn't look at the jury. I hadn't looked at them once during the verdict reading. There was nothing left to read on their faces that I hadn't already accepted in my chest. 3 seconds. My lawyer said my name once, soft and broken. I didn't answer. 2 seconds. The room smelled like old wood and certainty. 1 second. And then from somewhere in the gallery, from a woman who could not see a single face in that room, came a voice that split the silence in two. That man was with me. The gavel froze.
Nobody in that courtroom looked at my face. They never did. They looked at my hands, specifically at the ink that crawled from my knuckles all the way up past my collar and onto my throat. Rose stems with no flowers. A dragon coiled around my left forearm like it was holding on. Script in a language the prosecutor had called gang-affiliated during opening arguments, even though it was a line from a poem my mother used to read to me when I was 7 years old. The handcuffs sat just below the dragon's tail. Cold steel against old ink. That was the image they wanted burned into the jury's memory. That was the story they had built their entire case on. Not evidence, not witnesses, not a single piece of hard proof that placed me at the warehouse on the night in question. Just the idea of me. Just the visual of a man who looked exactly like what they needed him to be. I had let them build it. My lawyer, Davies, had spent 3 weeks begging me to testify. He had spreadsheets. He had a timeline. He had character witnesses lined up like dominoes, ready to fall in my direction if I would just give him something to work with. One name, one location, one phone record that would explain where I actually was on the 14th. I had sat across from him in the holding room, hands folded on the metal table, and said nothing. He had looked at me the way people look at someone who has already decided to drown. Maybe he wasn't wrong. The thing about carrying a secret for 10 years is that it stops feeling like a burden. It starts feeling like a bone, something that grew inside you quietly, shaped itself around everything else, and became load-bearing without you ever noticing. By the time I walked into Courtroom 7, the silence wasn't even a choice anymore. It was just the architecture of who I had become. I looked down at my hands now, resting in my lap, chained together at the wrist. The dragon stared back at me from my forearm, frozen mid-coil. Permanent, unashamed. The prosecutor had called me dangerous. He had pointed at these hands 3 separate times during closing arguments, his voice rising each time like he was working toward something holy. The hands of a man, he said, who has spent a decade operating above the law. The jury had followed his finger like a compass needle following north. None of them looked past the ink. None of them asked what these hands had actually done in the dark, what they had carried, what they had shielded, what they had refused to put down even when every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. The officer's fingers pressed deeper into my shoulders. Above me, the gavel was still suspended in the air, frozen in the second after Maria Johnson's voice had cracked the room open like a fault line. I still hadn't turned around to look at her. I was afraid that if I did, I would finally break. Maria Johnson had not always known she was being watched. In the beginning, it was just a feeling. The way the air in a room shifts when someone enters it. A pressure change so small that most people would wave it away as nothing. A draft, a mood, the tail end of a dream they couldn't quite shake. Maria had learned long ago that most people waved away the things they couldn't name. She couldn't afford to. When you lose your sight at 19, you either learn to trust the world your other senses build for you, or you spend the rest of your life walking into walls. Maria had chosen to trust. She had no other option. She learned the rhythm of her neighborhood the way a musician learns a song. Not by reading it, but by living inside it until it became part of her breathing. She knew which floorboard in her hallway creaked at a different pitch in winter. She knew the particular silence that came before rain, how it pressed against the windows like something waiting to be let in. She knew the sound of her own footsteps on pavement, and, over time, she learned to notice when another set of footsteps stayed just far enough behind hers to be almost imperceptible. Almost. She had never said anything about it. For years she told herself it was nothing. City noise. Coincidence. The echo of her own movement bouncing off brick walls and coming back to her rearranged. But the footsteps had a pattern. They were always there on the night she came home late from her second job at the crisis hotline. The ones that ended past midnight when the streets thinned out and the darkness felt heavier. They stayed half a block back, always. They never rushed. They never retreated. They simply kept pace, like a shadow that had learned to breathe. And twice, only twice in 10 years, she had felt something else. The first time was on a Tuesday in October, 3 years after she'd lost her sight. She had taken a wrong turn in an unfamiliar part of the city, her cane tapping against unfamiliar curbs. She'd heard voices she didn't recognize, smelled cigarette smoke and something metallic underneath it, felt the specific quality of silence that means you have walked somewhere you are not welcome. Her pulse had spiked. Then she'd heard him. Not words, just a sound. Low, controlled, barely more than a shift in the air between her and the voices. Whatever he said or did or simply became by standing there, the other sounds had dissolved. Footsteps walking away, tension draining out of the block like water through a crack. And then quiet. Safe quiet. She had stood there for a long moment, her cane still, her head tilted. "Hello?" she had said. Nothing answered, but the footsteps that followed her home that night were the same ones she had always known. Steady, patient, half a block back. And for the first time, instead of pretending they weren't there, Maria had simply whispered, "Thank you," into the dark. She never knew if he heard her. She had always believed he did. They called themselves a board of directors, 12 men and 2 women who met on the 43rd floor of the Hargrove Tower every third Thursday of the month, in a room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the city that made everything below look small and manageable. Which was, of course, the point. They wore suits that cost more than most people's cars. They had assistants who answered emails at midnight, and lawyers who answered phone calls at 3 a.m. They gave to charities. They sat on hospital boards. They shook hands with the mayor at fundraisers and smiled the particular smile of people who have never once in their lives been afraid of what tomorrow would bring. They were also responsible for every gram of product that moved through the city's port district, every bent officer on the Eastern Precinct payroll, and the disappearance of a federal auditor named Dennis Cho, who had gotten uncomfortably close to their shipping manifests 18 months ago. Dennis Cho's case was still officially open. It would stay that way. The man who had been building a case against all of it, quietly, patiently, across a decade of late nights and encrypted files and meetings in parking garages, was currently sitting in handcuffs in Courtroom 7. That was not an accident. That was a decision made in the same room with the floor-to-ceiling windows by the same people with the charitable donations and the midnight lawyers. Senator Hargrove had been the one to say it plainly, because Senator Hargrove had always preferred plain language when the room was secure. He had looked around the table with the calm expression of a man ordering lunch and said, "We need to clean the board. Bora has become a liability." No one had disagreed. The frame had taken 4 months to construct. It was elegant, as these things went. A warehouse, a set of falsified transfer records, 2 witnesses whose mortgages had quietly been absorbed by a shell company the previous spring. The evidence didn't need to be airtight. It just needed to be sufficient. Juries, they had learned, were not looking for certainty. They were looking for a story that made sense. And a tattooed man with a known name in the city's underworld was always going to be a story that made sense. What they had not calculated, what none of them, with their 43rd floor view and their manageable city, had thought to calculate, was Maria Johnson. They didn't know she existed. That was the one thing Bora had done perfectly, in 10 years of doing everything alone. He had kept her name out of every file, every conversation, every room. She was the one variable he had protected so completely that even the people trying to destroy him had no idea she was the reason he had never run. On the 43rd floor, they raised their glasses that evening and assumed it was over. They were wrong. They just didn't know it yet. 10 years ago, the alley behind Meridian Street smelled like rain and rust. I wasn't supposed to be there. My assignment that night was a warehouse 2 miles east, a scheduled handoff between the syndicate's port contact and a middleman who'd been sloppy enough to leave a paper trail. I had a camera, I had a position, I had 2 hours before the meet and nothing to do but wait. Then I heard the cane. It was a specific sound, the rhythmic tap of it against wet pavement, unhurried, confident, belonging to someone who had learned to trust it completely. I registered it the way you register background noise, filed it away without thinking. But then I heard the other sounds, footsteps that weren't mine. The low murmur of men who had stopped moving because something more interesting had walked into their night. I came around the corner before I had made a conscious decision to move. There were 3 of them. They weren't syndicate, just opportunists, the kind the city produced in unlimited supply when the lights were dim and the block was empty. They had positioned themselves in a loose semicircle, the way people do when they want to make something feel inevitable. The woman with the cane had stopped walking. Her head was tilted slightly, reading the situation through sound and air pressure, processing what her eyes could not. She was 19 seconds from something I was not going to let happen. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't reach for anything. I simply stepped into the space between her and them and became, in that moment, the most dangerous presence in the alley. I had spent years learning how to do that, how to make the air around me shift in a way that communicated a very specific and non-negotiable message. The men read it. Men like that always did. They were predators, not martyrs. They left. The whole thing took less than a minute. I turned to check on her, already planning my exit. She was standing very still, her head still tilted at that slight angle, her cane held close. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't crying. She was simply listening, taking inventory of what had just happened with the same quiet precision she probably applied to everything. I should have left then. What I did instead was stand there for 10 more seconds, long enough to confirm she was steady on her feet and oriented toward the main street. That was the professional choice, the operational choice, the only choice that made any sense. Then, as she began to walk again, she passed within 3 feet of me, and I caught the faintest trace of something. Cedar and soap, ordinary and clean, the smell of a life lived with dignity in a world that made dignity difficult. I thought about the men who had just walked away. I thought about what they had seen when they looked at her. A target, a vulnerability, something the city had handed them for free. I thought about how many others like them the city contained. I followed her home that night, and the night after that, and for 10 years after that, because I understood, with the cold clarity of someone who has spent too long inside the machinery of how evil actually operates, that the moment Maria Johnson had walked into that alley, she had become something the syndicate could eventually use against me. The only way to keep her safe was to never let them know she existed. The only way to do that was to never leave her unguarded. I had told myself it was strategy. I had told myself it was mission logic. Clean, calculated, operational. But I remembered the cedar and the soap. And I knew, in the part of me that had not yet gone entirely cold, that it was also something else. Something I had no right to name. Davies had brought a whiteboard to the holding room. I remember staring at it. This portable whiteboard on a collapsible stand, squeaking against the concrete floor every time he moved around it, and thinking that it was the most optimistic object I had ever seen. He had color-coded everything. Green for alibi windows, red for prosecution claims, blue for witnesses he believed he could flip. There was a lot of green. He had done real work, good work, the kind of work that deserved a client who was willing to be saved. All I need, he said, uncapping a marker for the 4th time that session, is a name. One name, Bora. One person who can place you anywhere other than that warehouse on the 14th. That's it. That's the whole case. I looked at the whiteboard. There's no name, I said. Davy set the marker down on the tray with the careful precision of a man managing his temper. He had 2 kids. I knew this because he kept a photo of them on the corner of whatever surface he was working from. A habit so automatic he probably didn't notice he did it anymore. 2 girls, maybe 8 and 10, squinting into summer sun. He loved them in a way that was visible from across a room. "You were somewhere," he said quietly. "On the night of the 14th, you were somewhere that wasn't that warehouse. I know it. You know it. The prosecution has 2 witnesses who've been compromised and a paper trail that has 3 separate chain of custody gaps. I can win this case, but I need you to give me something to win it with." The thing about Davies was that he actually meant it. He wasn't performing. He had taken this case at a reduced rate because something about the evidence profile had bothered him from the beginning, and he was the kind of man who couldn't let things that bothered him alone. Under different circumstances, I would have trusted him completely. Under these circumstances, trust was the one thing I could not afford. I thought about Maria. I thought about the way her name would sound in this room, in this building, echoing through court records and deposition transcripts and the inevitable leak to whatever syndicate-connected journalist had been assigned to monitor this trial. I thought about how quickly a name becomes an address, how quickly an address becomes a target. I thought about cedar and soap. 10 years of late nights and wet pavement, and the particular peace of watching someone move through the world safely. Someone who had no idea that the world had, on multiple occasions, decided she was a loose end that needed tying. "There's no name," I said again. Davies looked at me for a long moment. Then he picked up the marker, recapped it slowly, and began breaking down the whiteboard. He didn't slam anything. He didn't raise his voice. He just quietly packed up every piece of evidence that could have saved my life, folded the stand under his arm, and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "Whatever you're protecting," he said, without turning around, "I hope it knows what you're paying for it." He left. I sat alone in the concrete room and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The price had been set 10 years ago in a rain-wet alley on Meridian Street. I had agreed to it then without knowing, the moment I chose to follow instead of walk away. I didn't regret it. That was the part I could never explain to anyone. Maria had not planned to come to the trial. She had learned about it the same way she learned about most things. Through the radio, through the particular texture of conversations around her that changed when people thought she wasn't paying attention. A man named Bora. Organized crime. A verdict expected by end of week. The anchor's voice had carried that specific flatness that meant the outcome was already assumed, the story already written, the coverage already pivoting toward whatever would come next. She had sat very still at her kitchen table and listened to every word. The name meant nothing to her. She had never known a name. For 10 years, her guardian had existed only as a presence, a rhythm, a pattern, a specific quality of stillness that the city's noise arranged itself around on the nights he was near. She had built a portrait of him entirely out of negative space, the way sculptors described finding the figure inside the stone. But something about the radio report had pulled at her. A thread she couldn't identify, attached to something she couldn't name. She had asked her neighbor's daughter to read her the trial coverage online. She listened to descriptions of the courtroom, the defendant, the charges. Then the girl had read, almost as an aside, that the defendant had sat through 3 weeks of testimony without speaking once, without flinching, without, as one reporter noted, appearing to inhabit the room in any emotional sense at all. Maria had gone very quiet. She knew that quality. She had felt it from half a block away year after year. That particular brand of stillness, that wasn't emptiness, but discipline. The stillness of someone who had trained themselves to take up no unnecessary space, to leave no unnecessary impression, to exist at the precise boundary between presence and invisibility. She had arranged a ride to the courthouse for the final day of proceedings. She told no one why. She wasn't entirely sure herself. She found a seat in the 3rd row of the gallery, folded her cane across her lap, and waited. The room settled into its formal rhythms, the shuffle of papers, The low exchange of procedural words, the particular acoustics of a space built to make individuals feel small against the weight of institutional authority. Maria filtered all of it, sorting through layers of sound the way she always did, looking for the signal underneath the noise. And then she found it. It came from the front of the room. A breathing pattern, slow, measured, and controlled in a way that spoke not of calm but of profound, deliberate surrender. The breath of someone who had made peace with an outcome and was simply waiting for it to arrive. 4 counts in, hold, 6 counts out, steady as a tide that had decided where it was going and saw no reason to rush. She had heard that breath before, on Meridian Street, in the doorway of her building on winter nights, outside the crisis hotline at 10 minutes past midnight when she couldn't find a cab and the block was dark and she had never been afraid because something in the air told her she didn't need to be. Her hands tightened around her cane. She had spent 10 years wondering if she had invented him. This shadow, this rhythm, this presence that appeared and disappeared like a tide with its own private schedule. She had sometimes thought she was simply the kind of person who needed to believe she was protected and had constructed an elaborate story around ordinary coincidence. She was not that person. The breathing from the front of the room was real. She knew it, the way she knew her own heartbeat, the way she knew the creak of her hallway floor, the way she knew every sound that had ever mattered enough to anchor itself permanently in the dark architecture of her world. Her guardian was sitting in chains at the front of the room, and no one was going to save him. The realization didn't arrive gently. It landed with the full weight of 10 years behind it, and Maria sat with it for exactly as long as she needed to. Which was not long at all. She had never needed long once she knew something was true. Prosecutor Whitfield had a gift for pausing. He knew exactly how long a room could hold silence before it became unbearable, and he knew how to fill that silence with just enough movement. A slow turn toward the jury, the deliberate set of his shoulders, the measured click of his shoes against marble, to make the waiting feel like inevitability building toward its natural conclusion. He had won 31 consecutive cases. The legal press had written about his closing arguments the way sports writers wrote about athletes at the peak of their form. Controlled, precise, devastating. He approached the jury box the way a man approaches something he has already decided belongs to him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, and his voice had that particular quality of someone who had never once doubted that rooms would go quiet when he spoke. "You have spent 3 weeks listening to evidence. I want to take just a few minutes of your time to remind you of what that evidence actually means." I didn't look at him. I had made a decision on the first day not to watch Whitfield perform, because that was what it was. A performance, constructed and calibrated and aimed with the precision of someone who understood that juries did not convict on facts alone. They convicted on feeling, on the accumulated emotional weight of a story told well. Whitfield told it well. He walked them through the warehouse records first, the falsified documents that had been crafted well enough to survive 3 weeks of scrutiny from a defense team that already knew they were fabricated but couldn't prove it. He spoke about the 2 witnesses with the careful reverence of someone presenting saints rather than men whose mortgages had quietly vanished from their debt portfolios 6 months earlier. He used the word pattern 11 times. I counted. Pattern implied design. Design implied intention. Intention implied guilt so settled and deliberate that it had become a feature of my character rather than an accusation about a single night. Then he turned to the tattoos. I had expected this. He had been building toward it since opening arguments, planting small references throughout the trial like seeds he was now ready to harvest. He didn't say the ink made me dangerous. He was too skilled for that, too aware of how such an argument would read in the transcript. Instead, he simply described me, my appearance, my history, my decade of operating in spaces that polite society preferred not to examine too closely, and he let the jury's own architecture do the rest. He gave them the image and trusted them to supply the conclusion. This defendant, Whitfield said, arriving finally at the center of the room where he liked to stand for his closing lines, had every opportunity to explain himself. to offer a single reason, one solitary account of where he was and why on the night in question. He paused, his best pause, the one he saved for endings. His silence is not a mystery, members of the jury. It is his answer. The room absorbed it. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, the chain between the cuffs resting against my knuckles, and I thought about Maria in the third row of the gallery behind me, her cane across her lap, her head tilted at that slight angle. I thought about the breathing she had recognized. I thought about whether she had truly understood what she was hearing, or whether she was simply present the way good people sometimes are, drawn by instinct toward the places where something important is being decided, without knowing yet what they're going to do about it. Whitfield returned to his table and sat down with the smooth economy of someone who had just completed a task to his complete satisfaction. The room felt like a held breath. In the gallery, I heard the faint, almost imperceptible tap of a cane shifting against a wooden bench. Just once. Like a decision being made. Judge Harmon was not a theatrical man. That was what made him effective. He had presided over Courtroom 7 for 19 years with the same deliberate economy he brought to everything. No flourish, no performance, no visible investment in outcome. He read verdicts the way a weatherman reads forecasts. The facts were the facts. The law was the law. His job was simply to be the mechanism through which one became the other. He opened his folder. The room had already gone quiet, but when Harmon reached for his glasses and settled them onto the bridge of his nose, the quiet deepened into something else, something with physical weight. I felt it press against my eardrums, against the back of my throat, against the place in my chest where breathing had become a conscious effort sometime in the last hour. The officers behind me had gone still. Even they understood that the room had entered a different register now, that we had passed through the last procedural gate and were standing at the edge of the only thing that had ever mattered in this building. The end. Harmon cleared his throat once, a sound like a door closing in an empty house. In the matter of the state versus Bora, he began, and his voice carried the particular flatness of someone reading from a document they have already read privately, already processed, already filed away in the cabinet of completed things. This court has carefully considered the evidence presented over the course of these proceedings. Davies was rigid beside me. I could feel it without looking, the specific tension of a man who has done everything right and is watching it fail anyway, who has run every calculation and cannot make the numbers come out differently, and is now simply waiting for the mathematics to confirm what he already knows. I looked at my hands one more time, the dragon on my forearm, the roses with no flowers, the line of my mother's poem curling around the inside of my wrist in script too small for anyone across a courtroom to read. I had gotten that one last when I was 23 and had already decided what kind of life I was going to lead and what it was going to cost me. I had wanted something permanent to mark the decision, something I would see every day. What is given in darkness is not lost. It is kept by the dark. I had believed that for 10 years. I believed it now. Harmon lifted his gavel. The motion was unhurried, inevitable. The gavel rose in a slow arc above the block, and the room contracted around it. Every breath in the gallery held, every body leaning infinitesimally forward, the entire weight of the proceeding balanced on that single suspended point between the raising and the falling. I closed my eyes. I heard the creak of a wooden bench. I heard the soft, deliberate plant of a cane against the marble floor. I heard a woman stand up. The gavel froze, not because Harmon chose to stop, because the sound that came from the gallery was the kind that bypasses judicial procedure entirely and goes straight to the part of the human brain that understands, on a level older than law, that something irreversible is happening. That man was with me. Maria's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the quality of something that had been held in reserve for exactly this moment, steady and clear, and carrying the particular authority of a person who has spent a decade learning to make themselves heard in a world that could not see them. Every head in the room turned. I turned too. For the first time in 3 weeks of proceedings, I turned around completely in my chair, the chain between my cuffs pulling taut, and I looked at her. She was standing in the third row, one hand on the back of the bench in front of her for orientation, the other extended, arm raised, finger pointed, aimed with an accuracy that made no logical sense and perfect human sense simultaneously. She was pointing directly at me, not approximately, not in my general direction. Directly at me, across 30 feet of marble and air and a decade of deliberate distance. She could not see my face. She could not see my tattoos, the handcuffs, the white shirt Davies had chosen because it pulled well with juries. She could not see any of the things that had convicted me in this room before a single word of testimony had been spoken. She had found me anyway. Harmon's gavel was still suspended above the block. His hand had not moved. His face had not moved. But his eyes had shifted to Maria with the focused attention of a man recalibrating everything he believed was already settled. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "this court is in the process of... I know what this court is in the process of." Maria's voice did not waver. "That's why I'm standing." The silence that followed was a different kind than any the room had produced before. Not the silence of a held breath, the silence of a held world. She turned her head toward the judge's bench with the same unerring accuracy she had used to find me, and she began to speak. She told him about the alley on Meridian Street. She told him about 10 years of footsteps, half a block behind her on the nights the city felt dangerous. She told him about the breathing she had memorized without meaning to. 4 counts in, hold, 6 counts out. The same breathing she had been listening to from the front of this room all morning. She told him about the night of the 14th. How she had been walking home from the crisis hotline at 11:30. How she had heard those same footsteps behind her, steady and patient, all the way to her door. How she had stood on her front step for a moment before going inside and said out loud to the empty street behind her, "Good night." The way she always did. "He was with me," she said again. "He is always with me, and I will not sit quietly while you put him away for it." The courtroom erupted. Harmon's gavel came down, hard, once, twice, but this time it was calling for order rather than delivering a verdict, and there was a significant difference. Whitfield was on his feet. Davies was on his feet. The officers behind me had loosened their grip without appearing to notice they had done it. I was still looking at Maria. She had lowered her arm. Her chin was level, her posture straight, her hand resting on the bench back, with the steadiness of someone who has completed a task they decided on days ago and have no regrets about. She was not trembling. She was not uncertain. She had walked into this room with a decade of truth stored in her body, and she had simply released it. The thing I had been so certain I was protecting had just protected me. I felt something move through my chest that I had no name for and didn't try to find one. The dragon on my forearm seemed very still. The roses with no flowers seemed somehow less final than they always had. Davy's hand landed on my shoulder, not the grip of the officers, but something different. The grip of a man who has just watched the mathematics change. "Don't move," he said quietly, and his voice was doing something complicated. "Don't say a word. Let me work." I nodded once. For the first time in 3 weeks, I was willing to be saved. Across the room, Maria found her seat again with the economy of long practice, cane, bench edge, descent, and folded her hands in her lap. Her head tilted at that slight angle I had memorized from half a block away, reading the room through sound and air, processing the chaos she had just created with the same quiet precision she applied to everything. I watched her for a long moment. Then, because she could not see me do it, because it was a small and private thing that belonged only to the 10 years of dark space between us, I said it out loud for the first time. "Thank you." The room was too loud for anyone to hear it. I believed she did anyway.